All right, today is already the last lesson of this quarter in the study of 1 Corinthians. In the last chapter, chapter 16. Just to refresh our memories just a little bit, sort of review some things. This letter was written to correct some problems. There were some issues going on. The church at Corinth, which was a congregation of the Lord's church, just like the church in Sullivan, was having some problems. And some of the members there, especially a woman named Chloe, wrote to Paul to let him know about these problems. They also had some questions and they had some practical problems, and then they had some I guess we might call them doctrinal problems, some things that they were stumbling over, I guess we could say. So Paul wrote them because he was in Ephesus at the time. It wasn't in the cards, so to speak, for him to get to Corinth at that time. So he wrote them a letter in the meantime, and he dealt with all these issues, most of them, division and other, familial differences and issues. He dealt with the question of marriage and divorce and things like that. He dealt with some other things also. He dealt with the spiritual gifts for those 3 chapters from 12 to 14. Last week we looked at the chapter 15 about the resurrection. That was one of their doctrinal things that had crept into the church, whether or not there is such a thing as the resurrection of the dead, and he very extensively debunked the idea that the dead are not raised. There's no such thing as it. And he showed and he proved that very, very effectively. And then the last chapter, here in chapter 16, he deals with a very specific issue, not really an issue, but a specific situation that was going on at that time in the church at large, not just at Corinth, but it has to do with the collection that the church practices, and something specific about that. So, really, the solution to all their problems was to follow God's Word. That was as simple as that. That's the solution to every problem. Follow God's Word. And hopefully they would do that. But our book points out, just sort of by way of review, just how much you can learn from 1 Corinthians. It says, instead of promoting our own ideas or agendas, we must preach Christ crucified. That's something that Paul taught in this letter. Instead of ignoring or tolerating sin, we must seek purity. Chapter 5, that was another one of their issues that was going on in the congregation. They had a man there that needed to repent, wouldn't repent. So instead of ignoring or tolerating sin, he taught that we must seek purity in the church, not just in our own lives, but as a congregation. Instead of living for ourselves, we must acknowledge that we were bought with a price. Chapter 6, verse 20. Instead of flaunting our superior knowledge or understanding, we must take care that this right does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Another one of the issues they were dealing with there. Instead of thinking ourselves to be more important than other members of the church, we must learn that the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, that we're all one body, and that, yes, one may be different than the other, but that is not to say that one is better than the other, although we normally would rate it like that and view it like that, but we shouldn't, especially in the church. Instead of seeking to do great things, so-called great things, we must seek to have great love, to love. Instead of being swayed by doctrines of men, we must be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. So it is there's a lot to learn, especially for a congregation. It's not necessarily about specific, exact things in every instance, although it does touch on the Lord's Supper and giving, as we're going to see this morning. But just general principles, like how to treat our brothers and sisters in general. And then when we know in general, we will know how to apply that general principle in whatever specific situation that we may get involved in as a congregation. So here in chapter 16, the first half or so, Paul teaches an additional lesson. It's about generosity. Instead of thinking only of ourselves, we must give generously to the church so that needs may be met, is what we're going to see here this morning. It is one of the primary giving passages in the New Testament. And we already pointed out in this letter alone, we see what we sometimes call the 5 acts of worship. It's probably not the best thing to call them, but we do the best we can. 5 acts of worship. We see singing and praying are referenced there. We see preaching in there, and by implication, listening or studying, hearing. We see the Lord's Supper, and then now we see giving. So we see, and the connection with when you come together, as we pointed out with the Lord's Supper. When you come together, when you come together, when you come together, is when they did these things. So chapter 16, the first 2 verses, is usually the go-to scripture when the practice of taking up a collection is mentioned. So here's what he said. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. So, a couple things here. In general, we learn that, at least at this time, there was a collection for the saints. We'll see more about that as we go on further down. But this is what he brings up. It was something that had already apparently been going on, because he brings it up as something that they already knew about. And he says, I'm telling you what to do exactly as I told the church of Galatia to do. And here's what it was. Verse 2. The first phrase of verse 2 is probably the most important for a variety of reasons. And the ESV translates it correctly, and some of the other ones might also. But he says, on the first day of every week. Now, from a logical standpoint, by the way, the Greek has the word every. The word every, in the English, the Greek equivalent of the English word every, is in the Greek New Testament. But it doesn't even have to be there. When you say the first day of the week, what does that mean? Every time it comes around, doesn't it? We celebrate Independence Day on the 4th of July. Well, which one? Which July? Every July. I mean, every time July comes around and the 4th day of July comes around, that's Independence Day. You don't have to say the 4th day of every July, but Paul did say that. So even, it just removes that ability. People will find a way to disregard anything they don't want to believe. So no matter what it says, somebody's going to find a way to convince themselves it doesn't mean that. But this is why I always emphasize the objective logic. It's not subjective. It's not a matter of, I don't think it means that. The phrase, the first day of the week, means the first day of every week. But my point is, even so, the word every is in there. So it makes it a little bit more difficult, at least, for somebody to dismiss what he says there. And the significance is not just about the giving, but the implication that is when they came together. Because he says that you are to put something aside and store it up so that there will be no collecting when I come. The idea is whenever they would come together, they would store it up somewhere in one location. Everybody's, collectively. That's why it's called a collection. So that when Paul was able to come, it would all be there. It would be right there. He wouldn't have to go from house to house and, like that. That's the practical idea here. Paul's time was precious, and especially in this circumstance, there was a severe famine going on in Judea. And the Christians in Judea were suffering. So Paul had initiated, or at least taken up, this idea, this notion for the church to put some money together, all the congregations that were willing to participate, so that they could help the Jewish Christians over there in Judea. So that's what he's talking about. But as a rule for the church in general, this was something that the church was authorized to do. That may be the takeaway, first and foremost, is yes, he's talking about a specific collection. That is true. We do that sometimes, don't we? We have a special collection that is, in that particular instance, for a special purpose. But that's not to say, for instance, that somebody could look at this and say, well, this wasn't something he was telling the church. This doesn't suggest they did this all the time. So who's to say that we should do it all the time? Okay, fair enough. But it does suggest that if there is a need, that is something the church should do. If there is something that is in need of funding, like the some poor Christians, or how about some missionary work? We read about the church, some of the congregations giving money to Paul to help support him. In Philippi especially, they did that. And this is basically a precedent for a time and a manner, a method to do that. You first of all, you put something aside. That's the individual part. You put something aside. And then, the collective part is, you store it up together. So you put something aside, and then you bring it to the assembly, where you all collectively store it up. It's exactly what we do, isn't it? Every Lord's Day. Dean, did you have something?
Actually, at the time of this happening, we know that manner and stuff, which, like the letters that were wrote by the different individuals, they were hand-delivered. And that was the same with the collections. And Paul was one of the ones that took it upon himself to help do that, deliver the money, because in fact he was doing the traveling around, and he could.
Yeah.
But he would also have some other people, like I think Titus and Timothy, they were also helping him collecting it, so that when the time came that when he did come, then they didn't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
And that was the norm for at that time. Now, in this day and age, we got different methods of being able to do that. We either send checks and stuff like that, but it's still the same principle. We do collect it, and then we mail it to them.
Yeah.
But back then, they hand-delivered a lot of that stuff, and that's the only way they had it.
Yeah, that may be a good exercise in the difference between, the practice, specific practice that they were doing, and the way they got the money to the people. On the one hand, we take up the collection like we just described. But on the other hand, it would be going too far to say, well, Paul delivered it by hand, so we don't have any authority to deliver it in any other way than by hand. No, that's ridiculous. He delivered it by hand because that was the only way to do it. That was the only option, at least the only safe option, and even that wasn't incredibly safe because of that, the time and the place, and there were plenty of opportunities to be robbed and so it was still a risk. But that was the only method that. It's the same thing as preaching the gospel. How do you go to these places to preach the gospel? Well, Paul didn't fly on airplanes, so we can't. See, it's just a silly argument. It's also there is a certain group who argue very vigorously that the church treasury, the money in the church treasury, can be used only for the church, and sometimes this is the example used. The money. The only authority that we have is they used it for Christians. Well, you know what else? The same is true. The only example we have that the church's money was used for was Christians in Judea. So do we draw the line? Why draw the line at Christians if you're not going to draw the line at Judea? Because that's the same argument. So it doesn't stand up. But what we can take from this is an actual specific precedent for Christians to set something aside, put something aside. And if we think about it in terms of, back in that time period, most of us, whether we work or whether we receive income in some other way, we get a check, usually. It's a same check, for the most part. If you have a salary or an hourly rate, you just get the money. Sometimes it's even direct deposited into your account. And you don't have to manage your money in a physical way. But if you think about in a time where people may have been paid cash, and especially if you were somebody that like sold things or something like that, the money you take home, just like a waitress or a waiter today, is going to be drastically different probably from day to day, or week to week. So one week you might come home with a very large sum of money, and a week might come by where you bring home half of that. But the idea is, you get home, you sort through the money you made that day, and you put aside some of it based on that money. And you would do that every day. We just have to sort of translate that into modern day, the way we get paid. And instead of it, what I'm getting at is, instead of it necessarily being the same. Now, if you generally give, right up there on your limit, as far as affordability, then maybe it would be the same, more or less. But if you give a little bit because of a perceived financial distress, well, what about whenever you're no longer in that financial distress? Are you going to then increase? Or are you going to keep giving the little amount? That's another thing that we see in verse 2. As he may prosper. So you put something aside. On the first day of the week, you're going to put something aside and then store it up as you prosper. What does that mean? Yeah, what I already told you the answer. So, yeah, as you prosper, just the word "as" in itself suggests it is relative to something. And in this case, he says what it's relative to is what you're taking in. So, in another place, he said that the giving should be according to what a person has, not according to what a person doesn't have. So that's the same principle there, same idea. So this is, like I said, this is a precedent for the church collecting money as a congregation. This is what we would refer to as the church treasury. When Paul took this money, or I guess in another instance where the Christians in Jerusalem were selling things to have money to give to the church, they took it to the apostles, laid it at the apostles' feet. What do you think they did with it? Put it in their pockets? No, that's an accumulation of money from the church that would be what we would call the church treasury. And to be used for various needs. One is, like we just said, poor Christians in general, from Acts 4, Acts 2, Acts 4, and poor Christians in other parts of the world. Here in 1 Corinthians 16. Whenever Paul says, as I directed the churches of Galatia, I think it's very unlikely that he's referring to Galatians 6:10, do good unto all men, as you have opportunity, do good unto all men, especially those of the household of the faith. I do not think that Paul's talking about that. Our book makes that connection, but he's probably talking about something that's not even preserved, that surely Paul, there's no way that the letter to the Galatians was the only contact that Paul ever had with the churches in Galatia. There's just no way. So he had probably had plenty of contact with them, and at some point around this same time, he told them the exact same thing he was telling the Corinthians, and he also, in 2 Corinthians, informs that he also told the same thing to the churches in Macedonia. So this was a universal thing in the church, which, again, even more strongly sets the precedent for the church to do this when there is a need. And as we know, there's always a need, isn't there? At the very least, supporting a preacher and keeping the lights on and the air and heat running in the place where we meet. Those are needs that are never, especially the building stuff pertaining to the physical meeting place. Those are needs that will never not be there. So That alone is a precedent for the church to do this year-round, and not just whenever a specific thing comes up. Yeah, Dean?
Well, I know, when my mother-in-law, when she went on Israel, and she went into some of the thing of that place where they met, churches and synagogues. But in the synagogues, though, they had no chair, there was no seat at all. And that was just something that, they all stood all the time whenever they met. And of course, here we have seats.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong, but back then, that was just the custom.
That's the way they did it. Nobody sat down except the teacher.
Yeah, that was it, and that was just it. So there's so many things that, back then, that they did, and had to do, that was a lot different now.
Yeah. So again, where God has spoken, that we can't take away from where God has spoken and try to twist it to mean something else, but we also can't take it too far, like the examples I already alluded to, but have to use our reasoning. What do the words mean? What do they suggest? What do they not suggest? Because all words mean something. And when they're inspired of God, there's no room for, well, maybe he misspoke. Maybe, and then, he has to go and do a press conference and announce to the world, I misspoke. The problem wasn't with you inferring, but it was from my own words that I misspoke. There's none of that. So the words mean something, and there is an objective way to determine that, if you are honest, and that is a key. Not that you'll always get it right, but if you're honest, you will take it as what it is and nothing else. He says then, well, the next two verses, he says, when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they'll accompany me. So that's just the rest of that collection part. When I finally get there, I will, you can choose men to take the money. Who you know them better than I do, so you can choose who you think will be best. And if you would like me to go also, then I will go with them. They will come. We'll go together. So that there's probably wisdom in that also. It's very similar to in Acts 6 whenever they had the problem with the Grecian widows, and the apostle said, that's not something that we need to be dealing with right now. We're going to keep devoting ourselves to the word and prayer. But you pick men that you think would be best to do this. So you choose, and they chose Grecian Christians, brothers, to do that. So that's just wise, a wise move in handling things like that, to avoid any potential issues. Not that there would be. All right, so he goes more into his plans. I'll visit you after passing through Macedonia, for I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter, so that you may help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not want to see you now just in passing. I hope to spend some time with you, if the Lord permits. But I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a wide door for effective work has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. So, pretty straightforward, at least verses 5 and 6. I'm going to come there. I'm going to go through Macedonia. If you remember, we talked about Ephesus was on the western shore pretty much of the Aegean Sea, and Corinth was pretty much on the eastern shore of Greece. Not exactly the shore, but just a few miles inward. So it was pretty easy to travel between Ephesus and Corinth. Just hop on a ship and go there. And there were probably several ships, however many they could do in a day. They probably did in a day. But what Paul is saying is, he's not going to go. That's not what he intends to do. He's actually going to go up through the land and then go through Macedonia. So he would have to go north and then take a ship across the northern part of the Aegean Sea. And then he's going to visit Philippi and Thessalonica and those places on the way. And I think it's pretty clear the reason he's doing that is because he's doing the same thing there that he's going to do at Corinth. They had been taking up a collection. He's going to stop by there and see them a little bit and get their money that they had, whatever they had laid stored up, they will give to him. But he also says, I don't really want to just see you in passing. I want to stay there for a while. I want to spend some time with you, if the Lord allows, if the Lord wills, if He permits. There's something simple and yet moving about that, touching about that not just that he feels that way, but that he told them that. He tells them that. He wants to be with them. He wants to spend time with them. And I think the church today could learn from this. This family, it's a community, a family. They want to be with each other. You know how you can tell when two or more people want to be with each other? Spend time with each other? You know how you can tell? Because they do. They do spend time with each other. That's how you can tell. They like to be together, and you can tell because they are together. A lot. Or often, at least regularly. Not 2 times a week for an hour or 2. Just saying. They want. Paul says, I want to stay. I want to spend some time with you. But he says, as it is now, I'm going to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. And the reason is because the way he describes it, a wide door for effective work has opened. Has opened to me. A wide door for effective work has opened to me. A door for the gospel, obviously. Remember, Paul stayed in Ephesus. Don't want to get it mixed up with Corinth earlier. I believe either 2 or 3 years. I think maybe 3 years. Maybe it was 2. But he stayed there for at least 2 years. And at this point, he says, it's not time for me to go because this would be a silly time to leave. There is much fruit that is rising up in this work. So he's going to continue to stay there until Pentecost. Good lesson there for us too. That whenever we find that fertile soil, you need to plant your feet there. Don't give up. Don't move on. But when you find it, that's where your focus needs to be. And it's probably a good chance nobody will have to tell you that because of how fulfilling and fruitful it is for yourself even. Not in a selfish way, but just when the fruit appears before your very eyes, it's extremely encouraging and attractive to the person who's trying to sow that seed. And but even if there was something that came up that you may have to make a choice, Paul says, I've got to stay in it. I want to come and see you. I want to stay there for a while. But as of right now, I've got to stay in Ephesus because the Lord is doing great things here. And there are many adversaries. He wasn't ready. They weren't ready for him to leave yet. And if you remember, what was it that Paul told the elders of that congregation in Acts 20? After my departure, some bad things are going to happen. Grievous wolves. So even then, he seemed to understand they're not ready for me to leave. Because there are many adversaries around, and just like a shepherd for his flock, if there are wolves, hanging around just waiting, you don't want to leave the sheep. The sheep can't afford for you to leave them alone at that point. So he said, it's not time for me to leave, but I am coming. And he said, I might even stay the whole winter there, if the Lord permits. Okay, so finally, beginning of verse 10, he says, when Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he is doing the work of the Lord, as I am. So let no one despise him, Help him on his way in peace, that he may return to me, for I'm expecting him with the brothers. Timothy, young man, young preacher, young helper of Paul. Obviously, Timothy was on his way to Corinth as they spoke. Or maybe he was delivering this letter, but at least he was going to Corinth before Paul was going to. And he said, when he gets there, put him at ease. What do you think that means? Okay, make him feel welcome. All right. See to his needs. The basic things, at least. Shelter. A bed, food, water. It's just an interesting concept that we may, take for granted is the right way to put it, but the responsibility of the congregation to put this young brother at ease when he gets there. Maybe in mind and body. Put him at ease. Not the least of which, as he says, similar to what he told Timothy himself, let no one despise him. Yeah, Dean?
Well, too, we know that a lot of times since he was young, a lot of the older ones probably would not want to do what he was trying to teach them because of the fact they were older, he's young. And we know on another occasion that Paul talked about that and warned him that, don't let the older ones despise by you. So, I mean, and that's just one thing. A lot of times, we as older generations, we're not going to let some young kid trying to tell us what to do. And that's just it. That's just normal.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that Paul was trying to help him here, that when Timothy did get there, they were to receive him with open arms.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of something that maybe in human nature, for lack of a better word, I never like using that, but they might take it as, well, it's not Paul, it's not the big guy, he just sent his little helper. Who cares about him? It's not the real one. It's just his little servant, helper boy. But Paul's saying none of that. In fact, for Christians, that shouldn't exist anyway. Not just about, somebody that they perceive as an authority versus somebody that works with him or works alongside him, but anybody, no Christian should be viewed like that. But an interesting phrase, to let no one despise him. Same thing, like I said, that he told Timothy himself, let no one despise you for your youth. The word despise is an interesting word from our vantage point because it pretty much has one meaning in the way we use it. It's a pretty heavy word. It's a kind of an extreme word, despise. It means pretty much to hate, you loathe it, you absolutely abhor it. You do not, it's disgusting to you. You despise it. But the Greek word could mean something along those lines, but it can also mean simply disregard. I think Thayer, he defined it, to make of no account, to not even regard it, disregard. So whenever God says things like in the Old Testament, how because you despised my word, what were they doing? They were simply disregarding his word. They were ignoring it. So if we look at it in that light, then the concept of don't despise him makes a lot more sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that extreme sense, but just don't disregard him. Like he gets there, you say welcome, and then you're back to your own. You say hello, introduce yourself if they haven't met before. You introduce yourself, say hello, and then you go about your normal business, and then there's Timothy just there. Don't do that, Paul says. You put him at ease. Whatever you have to do to put him at ease. You encourage him, you welcome him, you help him in whatever way so that he can be on his way in peace. No stress, no additional hang-ups or hiccups, no troubles. It's your responsibility, Paul says, to make sure that he is put at ease and that you help him and don't despise him. So there is something there. The fact that he's putting that responsibility on them. Then he says, now concerning Apollos. So see, he's apparently going to be sending two men, Timothy and Apollos. He says, concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to visit you with the other brothers, but it was not at all his will to come now. He'll come when he has opportunity. Just telling it like it is. But the footnote in my Bible says that it possibly could mean that it was not God's will for him. But I don't know how your translation reads. It seems most of them, if not all of them, read more like the ESV, that it was not his will to come. Of course, his could mean God, but unlikely because he doesn't mention God at all before that. So he says, I wanted Apollos to go, but he didn't want to go. But he will come as soon as he gets the chance. Yep.
He possibly could have other commitments too ahead of this, and he wanted to do them first. So he didn't refuse to go there. He was going to go there, but not at this time. He had something else that he wanted to do. I think he might have other previous commitments that he felt that he should fulfill before this, and then go on over.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously, even Paul himself said, I want to come, but I can't right now. So obviously he would understand if Apollos deemed that it was not a good time for him to go. But he had agreed to go whenever he has the chance. But in the meantime, Paul says, be watchful. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. That's offensive. Be strong. And let all that you do be done in love. This verse is kind of a good exercise in why the old King James Version is not necessarily the best thing for people to use regularly today, because, just for example, would any of you ever choose to use the Greek New Testament for your daily Bible? Why not? Yeah, you don't read Greek. Can't read Greek. So in order for you to be able to use the Greek New Testament, you would have to have it translated into English. Well, in my opinion, in many instances, or if not most instances, that's how the old King James is. You need it to be translated because we don't talk like that. And here's an example. In the old King James Version and the Old American Standard for that matter, instead of act like men, it says, quit you like men. Yeah, if I hadn't already told you what it says, and if you weren't looking at it, I would dare any of you to try to tell me what quit you like men means. Because there's not a single way that we use the word quit today that could mean that. We don't use quit like that. Quit to us means stop. Stop like men? What, Paul's saying men are quitters? That doesn't sound right. You see, in order for that verse in the Old King James to make sense, you have to translate it into English, modern English. But that's neither here nor there. It's just one example. Somebody reading the Old King James, quit you like men. What in the world? What language is this? But even act like men is an interesting thing for Paul to say. What do you think it means? Okay. What was after stand firm in the faith?
Stand firm in the faith, be men of courage.
Be men of courage, okay. So what is that, New American Standard?
NIV.
Oh, the NIV. Act like men of courage, is that what it was? Be men of courage, okay. That kind of gives part of the answer. Okay, be brave. Yeah, that's what New King James says, be brave. Okay, yeah. I didn't even notice that. Yeah, there are two things, kind of the same thing, but that's the idea. Take it or leave it. You know, not all men are brave. But as a rule, that is, you know, what the men would typically do. Protect women, you know, and children. And they would be the ones to go and fight wars and as a nation, I guess. And then as, you know, each household, the man will be the one to protect his wife and the kids. So when he says act like men, that's what he means. And it's perfectly in the context. Almost every time, the context will give the meaning of a word. What's that word mean? Well, look at the context in the sentence, and you'll probably know the answer. Well, be watchful, stand firm, be strong, act like men. See, it's just all those, they go together. But it's kind of funny just because, you know, nowadays that would be so offensive. Like, what a slap to women that, you know, women can't be strong and brave. Silly. Dean? Yeah. Yeah, and they shouldn't have been viewed that way anyway. Even, you know, we talk about how Christianity liberated women, which it did. Nobody has ever done more for women than Jesus Christ. But even under the law of Moses, God, there were provisions in there that were out of mercy and grace for women. And sometimes we might overlook that. Now, any disrespect that the men showed for women, that's a different issue. But there's nothing offensive about men protecting women in general. And this at least would show, just the fact that Paul said that is a lesson for us men, that is what it means to act like a man. It's not the only thing it means, but it is one thing that it means to act like a man, to be courageous, strong, and standing firm in what's right, obviously. All right, very quickly. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2 should not be isolated from the larger context of the letter. We already talked about most of that. Even though that particular need was a circumstantial thing, it seems pretty certain and suggested that the act of collecting was not a one-time thing. It was to be done the first day of every week, even in that within the bounds of that circumstance. And it's not the only thing they did, but again, they also prayed and sang and preached the word and took the Lord's Supper. And if we want to worship the same as the first century Christians did, then we need to worship the same as the first century Christians did. Simple as that. And Christians are to love God supremely. Oh wait, the wisdom shown in handling the contribution, worthy of imitation, we talked about that too. Openness and honesty should definitely be the norm. Choosing the people who would be best to do that. And Christians are to love God supremely and their fellow man completely. Let all that you do be done in love. Similar to how Paul said, whatever you do in word or deed, do all to the glory of God, and do all by the authority of God in the name of the Lord. Also, let all that you do be done in love. Whatever it is, love should be the primary motivating factor. Thoughts, comments, questions? That's 1 Corinthians.